Hiya, this is Scott Farrell. It is April 23rd, 2026. I would like to talk about something that happened to me in my career many years ago. Now, this is something I am, for the most part, like 90% over, and for some reason it's just a fire in my head today. And it's long past time I make this call out video and do something, about an issue that happened, something wrong that was done to me, a severe wrong that was done to me many years ago. And it was committed by First Presbyterian Church of Winnebago. I was hired to be their accompanist in the autumn of 2009, and at the end of 2011, I was promoted to choir director. And I ran a little choir in that church called Grace Notes from 2012 to the middle of 2013. For the most part, we had a decent church choir. And some singers came and went, and that's just the nature of it. And I had a fairly decent grasp of the kind of repertoire that should be performed. At the very beginning, I wasn't that great. I didn't give a whole lot of thought to appropriateness for what matched the sermon, because that sort of thing was never really discussed with me. There was no planning period with the pastor or something like that. I just picked whatever, and whatever the group could perform, because I didn't have one real full soprano among my singers, and no real soloist. Yeah, no real soloists either. So I was also limited by my accompanist. What was her name? Lorita, I think. And she played at the church on the second Sundays of every month. She worked for another church, so that's why she was there for only the second Sundays. They paid me some, and it was a poverty-ass amount, but in those days I was grateful for it because it was doing something I loved, and I made some money from it, and I was okay. With the benefit of hindsight, I can see just how much they underpaid me. We will get to that later in the video. Got to the summer of 2013. After things had been good for several months, I had planned the beginning of the autumn season of choir of Grace Notes for 2013, and I had some ambitions, I had some ideas, and I was having fun with it, and we were doing a decent job. I really didn't hear complaints that often, and unless it was a song that just didn't work out for us. It fell apart on Sunday for some reason. Like, I don't know, important missing voices, for example, which is beyond my control, beyond anyone's control. Or the song just wasn't quite a match. But as I said, I couldn't really plan those things with sermon and what's appropriate and timing of the year for some reason. Just didn't seem to work out for some of them. Anyway, that's making excuses. That's a separate story altogether. Don't worry about that. Cut to summer of 2013. And August, I recognized that I was being underpaid, and I had expenses. All right, I was trying to build a life for myself, and my expenses had increased significantly since I started working for the church. And I had the audacity to ask for a little more money because, us church musicians don't make a whole lot of money. It wasn't a whole lot, it was a small, reasonable number. And every month, the committee they called session had their monthly meeting to go over things. And I submitted the proposal at the beginning of August. I gave it to the pastor, and there was a meeting, I think, on the 8th of August. I was not able to attend this meeting, and I later found out the consequences of that meeting over the phone. I went to an event over the weekend, and when I came back on Monday, I had a phone call from somebody at the church, a guy named Ted, who I had never met and never spoken to in my entire time there. And he said, it seems I drew the short end of the stick, but your request for a raise was declined, and we have hired Michelle West to be our music director. I found out over the phone from a stranger that my choir was in someone else's hands. Michelle West was the director of the praise team at the church. I barely knew her, but I had difficulty communicating with her in 2012 when her daughter participated in our Christmas program. She was mostly a helicopter parent and a control freak, and a wall that communicating with her was like talking to a wall that wants to talk at the same time as you. Incredibly frustrating because you couldn't convey directions or ask questions or get full answers to questions before she's talking again. Very frustrating woman. And not just because of what she did to me. Because her daughter had gone away to college, she had empty nest syndrome, and she decided she was going to fill this extra time in her life with helping her church and taking my job out from under me. She already knew I was choir director, and it wasn't even on the agenda for discussion that night, August 8th, with session. It just happened, and it was underattended. My supporters were not present at that meeting when they decided this. They gave my job to somebody else, and I didn't fully comprehend the meaning of the phone call. I thought, okay, I'd just be working for Michelle now. My choir is safe. Well, a few days later, I found out from the secretary that Michelle is choir director. Ted didn't come right out and say it on that phone call, and I must have called 100 people trying to get answers, find out what happened. And it absolutely shattered me because I built my entire identity around this pissant little job as choir director. And I was going to apply to be music director at the church. I'd been there for nearly 4 years. I was doing a lot of accompanist work, both on Sunday services and also some Ash Wednesday services and Christmas and other special events, including funerals. And I was well liked. I'd spent nearly 4 years building those relationships and making it work and becoming familiar with it and finding peace and finding professional growth and development and making progress. Sure, it wasn't a lot of money, but that was who I was. And in my mindset, when that was all taken away from me, I didn't recognize myself for the next 18 months. I absolutely fell apart. And I was reduced. Let's go back to the aftermath, the immediate aftermath of that. Michelle told me that I would not be her accompanist for the new choir either. And she wanted to do all of that herself, and Loretta and Dixie Ladine and I were all reduced to ciphers in the church. We were allowed to play only the hymns and incidental music in services, no more choir. I participated in Michelle's choir twice because it was the lesser of two evils. Either I sit back and watch her do my job and just be bitter about it, or I can participate and maybe I could learn to be okay with it. The reality was I wasn't okay with it because it wasn't okay. It was wrong, and the way they did it was wrong, and the way they told me over the phone was wrong. Imagine if your spouse chose to divorce you, but you didn't hear about it from them. You heard about it over the phone from their lawyer. How would that make you feel? That was exactly how I felt. And it was such a slap in the face. And I had to wait until the next session meeting in September when things were already in progress with Michelle and make my complaint, let them know how much damage this caused. And I cried for days. I'll have you know, I cried for days. I was furious. I was angry. I felt so betrayed. And it wasn't about the money. It was about right and wrong. I deserved to know. I deserved to be told. I deserved to be included in the transition. I deserved to be part of the planning. I had certainly earned it, and I built that. And she just came in and took it from me because she had empty nest syndrome. That's not how it works. You get your own job. You don't take someone else's. And I don't care if you've been with the church for 10 years and have a bachelor's degree. That doesn't make it okay. That job was still mine. And then it wasn't. I had such a surprise when they told me at the session meeting of September that I actually wasn't an employee of the church. I was a vendor. And I had been led to believe something different. I really thought I was an employee of the church. And I was certainly given freedom and treatment as such. And it kind of stopped me in my tracks because it created an even bigger situation. I couldn't file for unemployment because in order to get that in the state of Illinois, the business, the workplace must have at least 50 employees, and I wasn't one of them. So I was totally screwed. What they did in response to my complaint was give me a severance check for the choir because they recognized it blindsided me. And it was for 1 month's services for the choir. I was still allowed to stay on as the accompanist on the first and fourth Sundays of the month. And if Michelle wanted me for the choir or to be her accompanist, she will let me know. There is nothing Pastor Steve can do. There was nothing anybody in session can do. She has absolute control. And that bothered me so much. That hurt me so much. I felt like I was paid 30 pieces of silver for their betrayal. And compound that with the fact that I made less than $3,000 a year working for them. And they didn't have the money to give me just a piddly little raise for the increased cost of living over the 4 years I worked for them. But they somehow had $3,000 to give to Julie Badowski in 2011 for an absolutely mediocre job as music director. She was our music director for only a brief period in the beginning of 2011, and she got the job only because she was teaching music at the school next door to the church, and she needed a separate place to teach music. They thought that she was an absolute church mouse, a kind girl, but had no real passion for choir directing at that time. And they paid her $3,000 for January, February, and March of that year, when I ended up doing most of the work for her because she had no idea how to lead a vocal ensemble. And I was furious. I was furious when I saw that. I found out because I mistakenly reached my hand into her music box, her mailbox at the church one night when I was aiming for mine, which was right below hers as the accompanist, you know? And I pulled out that check. And for a sec, I thought it was for me, but when I saw who it was addressed to, $3,000 for Julie Badowski. And I thought, you sons of bitches. You had that money to pay her, but I can't live on more. I can't make $3,000 a year working for you, and I did all the work for her. On top of that, I got to be choir director, and you still weren't paying me that number. That took me all year to make that number, and that is not any money. That's peanuts. And then they gave the job to Michelle West, an absolute control freak, and in my eyes, a thief. She may have been very good as a music director. I don't really know. The 2 times I attended rehearsal for her, the 2 times I sang for her, I should say, she did not impress me in the slightest. And she didn't work the choir very hard. In fact, she added people to it. What pissed me off even more was that people were participating in her choir when I never knew them to have any musical ability prior to that. My group struggled some Sundays. We could not get enough people together to perform some of the music that was selected. And it was pretty basic stuff. I needed more than 6 voices to maintain grace notes. And sometimes because of sickness or travel plans or in other interests, other events going on. Like, I don't know, football games and stuff. And they were suddenly participating in her choir. And they wouldn't come forward, for me, but they certainly did for her. And that told me where I stand. What they did to me was absolutely wrong. And they got away with it. They tried to, some of them, a couple members, let's say that's more accurate, a couple people on the session committee tried to give me other work in the area doing what I was doing. But none of those churches would hire me, and they certainly weren't going to pay me anything. At least a couple of them weren't going to. And I felt condescended to, disrespected, frozen out of everything. And I wasn't even allowed to properly grieve for it. I had to grieve at home, in private, by myself. If I have any expression of grief at church, well, the hell with me, and maybe I'm the problem. That's definitely not the case. That's not how it works. And I recognize things change, but there still should have been discussion. There still should have been transition. There still should have been inclusion and due process. And I was denied every bit of that for I don't know what reason. I stayed on at that church for another 4 months. George Harnish was right. He told me I should have quit that church on principle, but at the time I had no other options, and I couldn't get unemployment. I couldn't find other work. It just, because that apparently didn't count as work history, I was not employed by the church, and they turned me into a ghost, wrecked me hugely. And I stayed on because at least it was still some money, and I still had those expenses. But I saw it fall apart gradually. I felt like I was no longer one of them. The new year came, a new session board was elected, because that's how the transfer of power works in a Presbyterian church, I think. And I needed to ask them for an increase a second time, because it just was not enough money, and $50 a Sunday was laughable. No, I make more than that now. Heck, I made more than that at my next church. It was not worth the investment anymore. I wanted it to work. I wanted to accept change. I wanted to be okay with it. I really tried. And after my second request, someone asked me if I was seeking a raise for all the accompanists, for Loretta and Dixie. I had to point out Dixie does that for free because she's been there for years, and she does that because she loves doing it. Loretta, however, has a job at another church plus a husband to support her. All I had was that. And there was nothing else. There was really no other way I could make any money. And the next day they called me and fired me. If I could be fired when I wasn't really hired. And that wasn't very good either, as you can imagine. I absolutely laid into them for it. But it taught me something. I saw who they really were, and what was really going on, and how much they actually cared for me, and how much they thought of me, and how much respect I had. And I left that church with my head held high, bleeding in the nose low. No, just a little. On January 12th, was it, of 2014? Yeah. I said my goodbyes. They gave me a severance check for January, which was a piddly amount. I got a check from the pastor's wife, which was almost a matching number. But at least it was a kind gift. And that was the end of that. For the next 9 months, I didn't know who I was. And I made a lot of out of character choices. I made a lot of decisions and there were a lot of things that were just not in my sphere. I had built this entire life for myself at First Presbyterian, and it was suddenly just evaporated one day for no good reason, no warning, no explanation, other than an empty nester wanted it. A transition, a discussion, something would have been respectful. They didn't do that. They completely skipped that step and ignored my feelings, and any respect just went out the window. And the way they did it was also wrong. I did manage to find other work through that year, through 2014. I was in a couple of pit orchestras for shows that spring for high schools, plus my production of HMS Pinafore in May. And something else I'm not allowed to talk about. that period. But by the end of September, I was in a very good place. I was hired to be choir director at Cherry Valley United Methodist. And it's just the next town over, opposite direction of Winnebago. Closer to home, twice as much money, and a better choir, and a lot more respect. First Presbyterian was never really held accountable for it. They caused me so much psychological trauma and upended so many plans and hurt so many people. Everybody that I told about that whole situation back in the day, they said I was wronged, and what they did to me was shameful, despicable, beneath contempt, and I made sure that the people in charge at First Pres, not the pastor, mind you, knew it. I made sure they knew it, and that it wasn't okay, and it was not going to be okay. One positive thing came out of that. And maybe it's not so much a positive thing as it worked out for the better. That really could have turned left instead of right, and made things a whole lot worse. The one rehearsal I attended for Michelle, I was the first to arrive, and I found her alone in the sanctuary. I kind of wish I'd knocked her on her ass and given that bitch a black eye, or a bloody nose, or something. And I can't tell you how hard it was not to. I really can't. Words won't describe it. Because I was so angry, and so hurt, and so betrayed, and she caused all of that. She caused that. She did not tell me what she was planning one bit. And actually thought I would work in the spirit of cooperation with her. The final insult from her came the day of my meeting with Session in January of 2014. I left this part out. I want to say this. I got a memo from her in my post box at the church. A typed memo that began, "Music is an important part of worship at First Presbyterian Church. As such, all accompanists will adhere to the following protocol." And she had 5 bullet points, and at least two of them were directed at me specifically. She didn't call me out and say my name. No one was mentioned by name, but I know exactly who she was talking about. And the others must have been for Dixie and Loretta. And she actually had the nerve to think that all accompanists will work under the leadership of the music director. Guess what, bitch? Fuck you. Because I don't work for the church, and therefore I don't work for you. You're a thieving piece of shit that stole my job and ruined my career and put my ass in limbo for 18 months, so you get no respect from me. What you deserve is to have your ass kicked from here to Tallahassee. And I don't care how qualified you are, or what your educational credentials are, or how long you've been with the church. That does not give you any, leverage above other people in the church, when you knew damn well that I was choir director. That being said, that was quite a number of years ago, at least 12. And for the most part, I'm over it, because I got something better. In 2014, despite what happened at the church in the beginning of the year, 2014 was really excellent. I got to explore so much and live a different life and explore and discover so many things, explore who I wanted to be, who I was going to be as a grown adult and as I entered middle age. Well, at least not for a few years. And I did get picked up at another church where I was there for 6 years as music director. And those were great times. I did so much better in that second job, and I felt so much more secure. I worked for it. I started at the entry level as an accompanist for Kelly Beeman, and then I built my way up to choir director, and I had some security, and I had relationships and a foundation, and I expected a future from that, and they absolutely snatched that away from me for no good reason. So yeah, the world deserves to know. I printed it in my biography, but how many people have read that? YouTube's a wider audience. That's an old hurt, and I needed to get that out. They deserve to be called out for what they did. She's no longer at the church, and I'm sure some of the session people are no longer on the board, or maybe they're no longer associated with the church, maybe they're no longer living. That was quite a number of years ago. Even the pastors moved on from that church. But they deserve to be called out, and the names need to be said. And that's Christian love for you. That happens. But it has not happened. Nothing like that has happened since then. At least not for me. And I'm grateful that's behind me. I learned a few things about myself, and I lived through a life-changing shift in my world. Yes, it wasn't much money, but it was important to me and it mattered to me. And at the time, it was really all I had going for me. Thank goodness I was able to climb out of that. Viper's nest. Maybe hornet's nest. One of those, something unpleasant. So that's that. Long video, but there you go.